When I first heard the term human rights, I assumed it was something solid, unchangeable, respected, global, something everyone believed in. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that human rights, though declared as universal, are too often ignored, twisted, or conveniently forgotten. They're meant to protect our dignity, our voice, our freedom, but in practice, they're not evenly applied. They're often just words printed in dusty UN documents or waved around during speeches while millions suffer in silence. I've seen countries boast about their commitment to freedom, all while locking up journalists. I've watched global leaders speak about justice, even as their governments turn a blind eye to torture, censorship, and abuse. It's not just happening in distant lands, it's happening right under our noses, and the hypocrisy is staggering. One nation condemns another for human rights violations while committing its own behind closed doors. The moment it's politically or economically inconvenient to speak up, silence becomes the strategy. What really gets me is the idea that some lives are treated as more worthy of rights than others. Refugees fleeing war zones are left stranded, begging for safety, only to be treated like statistics. Victims of authoritarian regimes are ignored because their country is a strategic ally. People are judged not by their humanity, but by their nationality, religion, or usefulness in someone's geopolitical agenda. That's not universal. That's selective morality. And don't think this is just a government issue. It seeps into our culture, our media, even our conversations. We speak up when it's fashionable, when it aligns with the trending hashtag, when it earns social credit. But what happens when the victims aren't popular? What if their stories don't go viral? Do their rights matter less? If we only care about human rights when it's convenient or socially acceptable, then we've already lost the meaning of the term. Free speech, for example, is a right we claim to cherish, but the moment someone says something unpopular or uncomfortable, the pitchforks come out. Instead of defending their right to speak, we cancel them, we silence dissent, we create an environment where people are afraid to say what they truly believe. That's not freedom, that's fear disguised as progress. Human rights don't just protect the people we agree with, they protect everyone, especially those we disagree with. I'm not saying every opinion is right or every action defensible, but the moment we decide that some voices don't deserve to be heard, we've stepped into dangerous territory. Human rights are not a popularity contest. They are not earned through virtue signaling or ideological conformity. They are meant to be universal, unconditional. Then there's the issue of justice. How can we talk about human rights if there's no accountability? We see leaders commit atrocities, yet face no consequences. Courts are manipulated, evidence is buried, and justice becomes an illusion. Victims are left with nothing but trauma and hashtags, while perpetrators walk free, shielded by power and privilege. It's a broken system dressed up in the language of morality. I've often wondered, are human rights just a fantasy? A lofty dream we tell ourselves to feel better about a world that's anything but just? But then I see the people who fight for them. The journalists who risk their lives to expose truth. The activists who stand in front of tanks, not with weapons, but with courage. The ordinary citizens who refuse to stay silent, even when it costs them everything. They remind me that human rights aren't dead. They're alive in those who are willing to stand up when it matters most. We don't need perfect governments or flawless systems. What we need is consistency. We need to stop picking and choosing whose rights to defend based on politics, race, religion, or convenience. We need to remember that the term human rights includes all humans, not just the ones we like, not just the ones we agree with, and not just the ones who look like us. The sad truth is the world is full of contradictions. We raise flags for justice while ignoring genocide. We call for equality while building walls. We celebrate progress while millions live without clean water, education, or the right to speak freely. That contradiction should bother us. It should make us uncomfortable. Because only when we're uncomfortable do we begin to question. And only when we question can we begin to change. So no, human rights are not dead. But they are under attack. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in broad daylight. And if we don't defend them consistently, loudly, and bravely, we will lose them. Not just for others, but eventually for ourselves too. Because the moment we decide that someone else's rights don't matter, we've already put our own at risk. People ask me all the time, what's the one freedom you defend above all else? Without hesitation, I say, error's freedom of speech. Not because it's fashionable, not because it's easy, but because once you lose that, you lose everything else with it. You can't have democracy, you can't have truth, you can't have justice unless people are free to speak, question and challenge. Now, I get it, free speech isn't always pretty. It can be messy. People say things that offend, provoke, even infuriate. But that's the price of living in a free society. You don't protect speech you agree with, you protect the speech you hate. That's the whole point. Otherwise, who gets to decide what's acceptable and what's not? The government, tech companies, a group of angry people on social media. That's a very slippery slope. And we're sliding down it faster than we realize. I've seen it happen in real time. One moment someone says something controversial, maybe it's politically incorrect, maybe it's just badly worded, and the next, they're cancelled, fired, banned, erased, not debated, not challenged, just deleted. That's not progress. That's authoritarianism with a friendly face. And here's the irony, it's always done in the name of tolerance. But there's nothing tolerant about silencing people because you disagree with them. Look, I don't have to like what you say. You don't have to like what I say. But we should both be free to say it. That's how ideas evolve. That's how societies grow. When you shut people down, you don't make their ideas disappear. You just push them underground where they fester, where they radicalize. But when you bring them into the light, challenge them with facts, debate them with reason, that's when real change happens. Some of the greatest movements in history, civil rights, women's suffrage, anti-apartheid, started as unpopular opinions. People thought they were dangerous, subversive, offensive, but they were allowed to speak and the world changed. Imagine if they had been silenced because the majority disagreed. That's the risk we're playing with today. We're so focused on protecting feelings that we're forgetting to protect freedom. I'll be honest, this isn't just a left vs right issue. It's not about which side you're on. Both extremes are guilty. Both try to shut down the other when it suits them. But freedom of speech isn't a partisan weapon. It's a principle. And once you betray that principle, even once, you open the door for everyone else to do the same. Eventually, the rules you use to silence others will be used to silence you. Take journalism, for example. If reporters can't ask tough questions or expose corruption without fear, how do we hold power to account? If artists and comedians are walking on eggshells, worried about every word, how do we keep culture honest and human? We need these voices, especially the uncomfortable ones. They remind us of what we're avoiding. They shake us awake. People often say, well, free speech has limits. And sure, it does. Inciting violence, threats, libel, that's not protected. But that's not what most people are being silenced for. They're being silenced for having a different opinion, for saying something outside the accepted narrative. And the mob doesn't just disagree, they want to destroy. Careers gone, platforms stripped, families harassed. That's not justice. That's vengeance disguised as virtue. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you only support freedom of speech when it suits you, you don't support it at all. You support censorship with a mask. True freedom means allowing people to say things you despise, as long as they're not inciting harm. It means letting truth rise through debate, not through forced silence. I've had moments where I've said things people didn't like. I've been shouted at, criticized, threatened. But I stand by the right to speak, because I know if I lose that, I lose the ability to stand up for anything else I believe in. And so do you. Let me put it this way, freedom of speech isn't just about talking, it's about listening. It's about being willing to hear what you don't want to hear. And in a time when echo chambers are louder than ever, that skill, the ability to listen, is vanishing. We scroll past anything that challenges us. We block, mute, unfollow. We don't argue anymore. We cancel. That's not strength. That's fear. You want to be a strong society, then learn to handle discomfort. Learn to confront bad ideas with better ones, not with censorship. Let people make mistakes, speak out of turn, be clumsy with words. That's how we grow. That's how we learn, not through silence, but through sound, through disagreement, through open dialogue. And yes, that includes protecting speech for people you can't stand. Because the moment you make exceptions, you're setting the stage for your own voice to be the next one erased. So let's not fool ourselves. If we want a society that values truth, justice, and equality, then we have to start by protecting the one thing that makes all of that possible, the freedom to speak. Without it, we're not free. We're just pretending. And I don't know about you, but I refuse to live in a world where we pretend to be free. I've always found it strange how quickly people can erupt with outrage over one injustice while completely ignoring another happening right next door. It's selective, And it's everywhere. We post, protest, hashtag, and cancel when it's trendy, when it earns social points, when it fits our political flavor of the month. But where's that energy when the victims don't match the narrative? When the outrage doesn't come with likes and retweets? This is the hypocrisy of selective outrage, and I've seen it over and over again. One country commits a human rights violation, and social media explodes. Celebrities, influencers, activists all jump in. But then another country, maybe a powerful ally, maybe one that doesn't get media coverage, does the same or worse, and suddenly, silence. No statements, no flags in bios, no heartfelt speeches, just crickets. Why? Because outrage today isn't always about justice. It's often about image. It's performative. People care loudly when it's safe, when it's popular, when it won't cost them anything. But real principles don't work like that. You don't get to pick and choose when human rights matter. You don't get to be passionate about one cause while turning your back on another just because it's inconvenient. Take global conflicts, for instance. We're quick to side with victims when the villain is someone the media has told us to hate. But what about when the oppressor is on our side? What if our own governments are complicit? Suddenly, the outcry becomes awkward. People start using words like complex or nuanced to dodge the issue. But the truth doesn't become less true just because it's uncomfortable. And don't get me wrong, it's not just political. It happens in culture too. We see celebrities get destroyed online for a single comment, while others skate by after doing far worse. Why? Because one is hated already, and the other is protected by fame, status, or ideological alignment. That's not accountability. That's mob rule dressed up as morality. I've had enough of the double standards. We can't keep pretending that we're standing up for justice if we're only standing when it's convenient. If a child suffers in one part of the world and it breaks your heart, then a child suffering somewhere else deserves the same heartbreak. Even if their country doesn't trend, even if their flag doesn't make it into your Instagram story. People love to say all lives matter or human rights are universal, but then act like only as some lives and as some rights are worth defending. That contradiction eats away at our credibility. It turns activism into performance, empathy into branding. Here's what really gets me. We've created an environment where people are afraid to call out everything equally. If you speak up for one group, some accuse you of ignoring another. If you try to support both, you're labeled problematic for not picking a side. But justice isn't about sides, it's about consistency. And without consistency, the outrage loses its moral weight. I've watched media outlets run endless coverage on one conflict, one cause, one issue, while completely ignoring another. Not because one matters more, because one fits the narrative they want to push. That's not journalism, that's manipulation. And when the public consumes that imbalance, they adopt that imbalance. They start believing that some tragedies are more tragic than others. That's how empathy dies, slowly, quietly, under the weight of selective attention. It's not just unfair, it's dangerous. Because when we selectively choose what to be angry about, we signal to the world that some victims matter more than others. We teach future generations that justice is conditional, empathy is optional, and truth is political. I remember watching people flood the streets over one injustice, which was completely justified, by the way. But when another crisis unfolded, one that didn't have a celebrity endorsement or a viral campaign, those same voices were nowhere to be found. And I'm not saying you have to care about everything, no one can. But when you actively suppress or downplay one tragedy while amplifying another, that's no longer human empathy, that's selective outrage. It's the same on social media. Post about one issue and you'll get applause. Post about another and you'll get attacked, unfollowed, cancelled. It's like we've decided that only as some truths are acceptable, that only as some injustices are worth our time. But when did truth become a popularity contest? We don't need more people pretending to care when the cameras are on. We need people who care when no one is watching. People who stand for what's right even when it costs them something. Followers, jobs, friends. That's what integrity looks like. We have to stop letting headlines control our morality. Just because a news cycle ends doesn't mean the suffering ends. Just because a celebrity stops posting about a cause doesn't mean the cause disappears. We need long attention spans, long memories, real conviction. So, the next time you feel that fire in your chest, the anger, the outrage, ask yourself, is this about justice or is this about fitting in? Are you speaking because you believe in it or because you're afraid not to? Are you standing with the oppressed even when it's inconvenient or just when it's comfortable. Because here's the truth: justice doesn't care about trends. It doesn't bend for popularity. It demands consistency. It demands courage. It demands that we stop treating outrage like a costume we wear when it suits us. And if we can't do that, then we need to stop pretending we care about justice at all. I've wrestled with this question more times than I can count. Gee, what happens when human rights clash with culture? At first, it feels simple. Human rights are universal, right? Non-negotiable. Every person everywhere deserves dignity, freedom, equality. But then you step into the real world where cultures, traditions, and beliefs are deeply rooted, passed down for generations. And suddenly, nothing is simple anymore. I've been in conversations where people say, "You can't impose your values on us." And I get it. No one wants their identity steamrolled in the name of progress. Culture shapes how we live, how we love, how we think. It's sacred. But here's the problem: what if that culture demands silence from women? What if it criminalizes love? What if it justifies violence in the name of tradition? Then what? That's where things get messy. When defending culture means accepting oppression. And I'm not talking about isolated incidents. I'm talking about systemic realities, girls being denied education because that's always been, LGBTQs, people punished just for existing, religious minorities treated like second-class citizens. If we excuse these things under the banner of cultural respect, are we truly respecting anyone? Or are we just too afraid to speak the truth? I've seen Western leaders stumble over themselves, terrified of being labeled culturally insensitive, while avoiding condemning obvious human rights abuses. They'll call it complicated or delicate, but to the victims suffering under those systems, there's nothing complicated about it. They're not asking for a cultural debate. They're asking for freedom, for safety, for life. And then comes the backlash. That's colonial thinking. They say, "You're just forcing Western ideals." But hang on a second. Since when did freedom of speech, the right to education, or not being stoned to death become Western? These aren't Western values. They're human values. They belong to everyone. Now, I know, there's a difference between disrespecting a culture and calling out injustice. This isn't about banning food, dress, or language. It's not about erasing identity. It's about confronting the parts of any culture, including my own, that dehumanize others. Every culture has beautiful elements worth preserving. But every culture also has things that need to evolve. And let's not pretend the West is above this either. We've got our own cultural blind spots. Look at how we treat refugees, how we ignore poverty, how we brush aside racism behind polished slogans. So no one's exempt from scrutiny. That's the point. Human rights must apply to everyone, everywhere, without exception, without excuses. Sometimes I think about a young girl somewhere in the world, smart, curious, full of potential, but told by her culture that she's worth less than her brother, told she has to marry someone she's never met, told to stay silent. That's not culture, that's control. And the moment we start dressing up oppression as tradition, we betray the very people we claim to protect. And yet there's a balancing act here. We don't fix this by barging into communities and tearing things down. We fix it by listening, by amplifying the voices already there, activists, reformers, brave men and women within those cultures who are already fighting for change. They don't need saviors, they need solidarity. Because the truth is, change means more when it comes from within. When a community evolves because its own people demand better, that's real progress. That's lasting change. But those voices, those internal reformers need the space and freedom to speak. And that's where the international community must draw a line, protecting the right to dissent even when it's inconvenient. I've spoken to people who say, "Why don't you respect our ways?" And I want to respond, I do, but not when your ways mean someone else can't breathe, speak, live freely. Respect doesn't mean silence. Respect means dialogue. And sometimes it means confrontation. If your tradition requires another person to suffer, then that tradition needs to be challenged. We have to treating human rights as optional depending on the geography. You can't say all people are equal in one country, then ignore abuse in another because it's their culture. That double standard not only weakens the cause, it gives oppressive systems cover to continue. And here's another layer of the problem. When we dogs speak out, we're often accused of being judgmental or imperialistic. But what's more imperialistic? Standing by while people are abused or standing up for those who can't speak. I'd argue that indifference is the worst kind of arrogance. It says, your suffering isn't worth my discomfort. I've reached a point where I don't care what side of the world you're on. If you're being silenced, beaten, or oppressed in the name of tradition, then your culture needs to evolve, period. No one gets a pass on basic human dignity. Not me. Not anyone. But here's the thing. We can have this conversation with empathy. We can challenge harmful customs without dehumanizing those who hold them. We can separate people from policies. We can say, I respect you, but I cannot accept what's being done in your name. That's the tightrope we have to walk. And it's not easy, but it's necessary. Because if we only defend human rights when it's politically convenient, we don't really believe them at all. So the next time someone says, that's just their culture, ask yourself, does that culture empower or imprison? Does it uplift or oppress? Because tradition may guide us, but it should never chain us. And no culture, no matter how ancient or sacred, should ever stand in the way of a person's right to live free.